Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 19. It is the longest chapter in the book, so expect it to be over an hour. So let's get into it. Chapter 19. Standing at the bow with Eliot the next morning, two kings of Fillory plowing eastward into the unknown, into the rising sun, never knowing what God or fate or magic was going to send rearing up at them over the horizon next. This was much more like it. This was the stuff. At first, it had been hard to admit it, to change gears again and just go with it. But then suddenly, it wasn't. Not with the morning sun on his face and the muntjac surging and galloping along under him. He'd missed a lot here, but he wasn't going to miss anything more. Earth was the dream, not Fillory, and it was going to that part of his brain where dreams went, the kind of anxiety-ridden, fiendishly detailed dreams that felt like they lasted for years. Through endless, meaningless plot twists which delivered you ultimately to a fate not even of death, but merely of permanent embarrassment. Fillory had taken him back. Welcome to the quest for the Seven Keys. Your adventure is already in progress. Bingle was atop the forecastle as usual, just like back in the day, but now he was sparring vigorously with another swordsman. It was Benedict, stripped to the waist, lean and brown, grimacing as he gave ground and then, unbelievably, beating Bingle back and pressing his advantage. The whole time he kept his wrist on his hip, swashbuckler style. The air rang with the loud scraping of steel on steel, like the gnashing of a huge pair of scissors. Their swords locked, stalemate. They broke apart, clapping each other on the shoulder and laughing about some point of technical swordsmanship. It was like watching an alternate timeline version of himself, a timeline in which he'd stayed in Fillory and learned to hold his sword at full extension for more than 2 minutes. Quentin caught Benedict's eye, and Benedict saluted him, smiling with those bright white teeth. Quentin saluted back. They squared off again. Bingle had found his discipline. Those guys are amazing. He hadn't heard Poppy come up beside him. She was watching the action, too. Can you do that? She asked. Are you kidding? Poppy shook her head. She was not kidding. I wish I could. The one on the right, the older guy, he's the best swordsman in Fillory. We had a contest. It all still looks like a movie to me. I can't believe it's all real. Wow. Bingle did one of his signature gymnastic tumbling passes. Oh my God. I thought he was going over the side. I know. I was going to take lessons with him. That sounds exciting. What happened? I accidentally went back to the real world. Then a year went by here in 3 days. Well, I can see now why you wanted to come back. It's beautiful here. I'm sorry I thought it was funny before. I was wrong. Quentin had expected Poppy to be miserable on board the muntjac. After all, she'd effectively been abducted from everything she knew and cared about and brought here. It was an outrage to every principle she lived by. And all that was true, and she'd spent a day being outraged about it. Well, half a day. Poppy had spent yesterday afternoon sulking when she showed up at breakfast this morning with a brand new can-do attitude. She just wasn't temperamentally suited to long-haul sulking. Sure, all right, she'd been accidentally transported to a magical world that, until recently, she had understood to be fictional. The situation wasn't ideal, but it was what she had to work with, so she would work with it. She was a tough one, Poppy. I talked to the other one at dinner last night, she said. The kid, Benedict. He's a big fan of yours. Benedict? Really? Did you see how he lit up when he saw you watching him just now? Look at him. He's killing himself to impress you. You're a father figure for him. Quentin hadn't seen it. How was Poppy here for one day and she'd seen all that? To be honest, I always thought he hated me. He's gutted he didn't get to go to Earth with you. He must be joking. And miss out on all the adventures here? Now Poppy directed her guileless blue gaze at him instead of the sword fight. What makes you think what happened to you on Earth wasn't an adventure? Quentin started to answer and stopped with his mouth open, because it turned out he had nothing to say. It was 5 more days before they sighted land. They were having breakfast al fresco on deck. Quentin, Elliot, Josh, and Poppy. It was a practice Elliot had instituted. The crew set up a table on the poop deck with a blinding white tablecloth clipped on to keep it from blowing away. He kept this up in a surprising range of meteorological conditions. Once Quentin saw him up there alone in a squall, munching on marmalade toast that was obviously soaked through with salt spray. It was a matter of principle with him. But today it was nice out. The weather was almost tropical again. Sunlight flashed off the silverware, and the sky was a perfect blue dome, though the food itself was getting pretty grim. The kind of unspoilable stuff that came out of deep storage late in an ocean voyage. Hard biscuits and meat so salty it was more salt than meat. The only thing that was still good was the jam. Quentin used a lot of it. So is this how it works? He said. The questing. We just keep sailing east till we hit something? Unless you have a better idea, Quentin said. Or Elliot said. No, just remind me why we think it's going to work. Because that's how quests always work, Elliot said. I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of it, but the lesson seems to be that you just can't force the issue with a whole lot of detective work. It's a waste of energy. The ones who go around knocking on doors and looking for clues never find the thing, the grail or whatever it is. It's more a matter of having the right attitude. What attitude is that? Elliot shrugged. I haven't got a clue. I guess we're supposed to have faith. I never really took you for the faith-having kind, Quentin said. I didn't either. But it's worked out so far. We've got 5 of the 7 keys. You can't argue with results. You can't, Quentin said. But that's actually not the same thing as having faith. Why do you always try to ruin everything? I'm not ruining it. I just want to understand it. If you had faith, you wouldn't have to understand. And why exactly are you looking for these keys? Poppy asked brightly. Or, I guess, why are we looking for them? Yeah, why are we? Josh said. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're cool and all. They sound cool. Can I see them? We don't really know why, Elliot said. The unique beasts wanted us to find them. But find them and do what with them? Poppy said. I suppose once we have them all, they'll tell us, or perhaps we'll know when we have them. Or perhaps we'll never know. They might just take the keys and pat us on the back and send us on our way. I don't know. I've never done a quest before. So, the journey is the arrival kind of thing, Josh said. I hate that stuff. I'm an old-fashioned arrival is the arrival kind of guy. For what it's worth, they told me the realm was in peril, Elliot said. So there's that. But it's not like the Holy Grail was actually useful for anything. I told everybody the Netherlands are jacked, right? Josh said. You think that's part of this? Quentin said. You think they're connected? No, well, maybe. Josh stroked his chin with his thumb and forefinger. But how? The Netherlands are down. Quentin ticked them off. Jollibee is dead. The realm is supposedly in peril. 7 golden keys, a dragon collecting buttons. If there's a thread running through all that, I'm not seeing it. Maybe he didn't want to see it. That would be a hell of a thread. You'd want to think twice about yanking on it. Someone up in the rigging shouted that he could see an island. The boat's prow scrunched almost soundlessly into the damp white sand. Quentin vaulted over the bow, just as it spent the very last of its momentum and landed on his feet on powdery white sand, with his boots still dry. He turned back toward the launch, bowed, and received a smattering of applause from its passengers. He grabbed the painter and hauled on it as the others, Elliot, Josh, Poppy, Julia, Bingle, Benedict, scrambled out on both sides. The air was quiet and still. It felt weird to be standing on solid ground again. "Worst away team ever," Josh said, wading up onto land. "Not a single red shirt." Pretty. That was the impression the island had made from a distance. Chalk cliffs that parted to reveal a small bay with a tidy beach. A row of single trees stood out against the skyline, so fine and still and green against the blue sky they looked like they'd been carved in jade. Vacation paradise. It was late afternoon. It had taken them most of the day to make landfall. They stood together on the shore in a knot. The sand was as clean as if it had been sifted. Quentin slogged across it and up the first dune to the crest to see what was beyond it. The dune was steep, and just short of the top he flopped down on the slope and peered over the crest. It was like being a kid at the beach. Beyond the dune were more dunes topped with scrub. Then a meadow. Then a line of trees. Then Ember knew what else. So far so good. Pretty. "Well," Quentin said, "let's get questing." But first there were more mundane matters to attend to. Quentin and Poppy and Josh had been in Venice 3 days ago, but this was the first land the men had seen in something like 3 weeks. They piled ashore in 2s and 3s, some of them cannonballed off the Muntjac sides into the flat green sea. After a suitable interval for goofing off, Elliot mustered them on the shore and sent them out in teams to find fresh water, gather wood for fires and new spars, set up tents, harvest the local fruit, hunt for local game. "We've fallen on our feet," Elliot said, once everybody had a job to do. "Don't you think? So far, I would rate this an above-average island." "It's so beautiful," Poppy said. "Do you think anybody lives here?" Elliot shook his head. "I don't know. We're 2 months' sail out from Castle Whitespire. I've never heard of anyone else coming this far. We could be the first human beings ever to set foot here." "Think of that," said Quentin. "So do you want to, what? You know, claim it for Fillory?" "Oh," Elliot considered. "We haven't been doing that. It seems a little imperialist. I'm not sure it's in good taste. But haven't you always wanted to say it?" "Well, yes," Elliot said. "All right. We can always give it back." He raised his voice, using the one he used to call meetings in order to order back at Castle Whitespire. "I, High King Elliot, hereby claim this island for the great and glorious Kingdom of Fillory. Henceforth, it will be known as," he paused, "as New Hawaii." Everybody nodded vaguely. "New Hawaii?" Quentin said. "Really?" "It's not really tropical," Poppy said. "The vegetation's more temperate." "What about Far-Flung Island?" Quentin said. "Like as one word, Far-Flung?" "Relief Island." Poppy was getting into the spirit of it. "White Sand Island. Green Grass Island." "Skull Island," Josh said. "No, wait. Spider Skull Island." "Okay, the island to be named later," Elliot said. Come on, let's find out what's on it before we name it. But by then, the sun was low in the sky, so instead they pitched in bringing sticks and dry grass back from the meadow. With 5 trained magicians on hand, starting a fire wasn't a problem. They could have made a fire with just sand, but it wouldn't have smelled as good. The hunting party came back flushed with pride, hauling 2 wild goats on their shoulders, and one of the foragers had spotted a patch of goats on the spotted a patch of something very closely analogous to carrots growing wild at the edge of the woods. That seemed self-evidently safe to eat. They all sat in circles on the cooling sand, the cold sea air at their backs, the warmth of the fire on their faces, and savored the feeling of being on firm ground again, with enough space to stretch out their arms and legs and not touch anything or anybody. The beach was covered with footprints now, and as the sun got lower, the light made monkey puzzle shadow patterns on it. They were very far from home. The setting sun moved behind a cloud, lighting it up from the inside like a pall of smoke, sunlight leaking out around the edges. Strange stars came swarming across the blackened sky. No one wanted to get back on the Muntjac, not yet. So when the light was all gone, the travelers wrapped themselves up in blankets right there on the sand and fell asleep. The next day, everything seemed a little less urgent than it had when they first arrived. Yes, the realm was in peril, but was it in immediate peril? It was hard to imagine a place that felt less imperiled than the island to be named later. There was a touch of Lotus Land about it, and anyway, adventure would find them when it was ready, or so the theory ran. You couldn't rush it. You just had to keep the right state of mind. For now, they would savor the anticipation and stay well rested. Even Julia wasn't pushing. I was afraid we would not get back, she said. Now I am afraid of what will happen if we go forward. They hiked up to the top of the cliffs on one side of the bay, and from there got a good look at more Green Island, with rocky hills heaped up in the interior. Birds roosted along the cliff tops in bunches. They had dull gray feathers on their backs and wings, but they had a way of turning in the air in unison and suddenly showing you their rose-colored chests all at once. Quentin was going to name them rose-breasted swoopers or something along those lines, when Poppy pointed out that they already had a name. They were galahs. They had them in Australia, too. The cook was a keen fisherman, and he pulled a prodigious number of fat, tiger-striped fish out of the surf, one after the other. In the afternoon, Quentin watched Benedict and Bingle fence with foils. They stuck wine corks on the tips for safety. He spent an hour just lying back on his elbows and looking at the waves. They were nothing like the brutally cold Puritan waves of his East Coast youth, which had sternly discouraged anything so frivolous as surfing or frolicking. These waves came slopping in smoothly, building up heads of boiling cream foam on top, rearing up for a moment, mint green and paper thin in the sunlight, then broke in a long line with a sound like fabric tearing. He wiggled his toes in the hot sand and watched the weird more optical effects that the miniature sand avalanches created. They went to bed that night, hardly having explored more than the thin crescent of island they'd already seen. Tomorrow they would strike inland, into the forest, and up into the hills. Quentin woke early. The sun wasn't even up yet, though there was a gray blur of pre-dawn to the east. He wondered what happened out there in the extreme east. The rules were different in Fillory. For all he knew, the world was flat and the sun ran on tracks. Everything was gray, the sand, the trees, the sea. Deep red embers smoldered under the gray ashes of the bonfires. It was warm out. The sleepers on the beach looked as though they had fallen there from a great height. Poppy had kicked off her blanket. She slept with her arms crossed over her chest, like a knight on a tomb. He would have gone back to sleep, but he was dying for a piss. He got up and jogged to the top of the dune and down the other side. It didn't seem quite far enough for hygienic purposes, so he went one farther, and at that point he figured he might as well get as far as the field and pee there. It was undeniably a vulnerable feeling, as he let fly into the tall grass, but the morning was as still as a painting, and they hadn't been completely stupid about it. Anybody who knew the proper reveal spell, meaning almost no one, would have seen a gossamer thin line of magical force, pale blue in color, looped along the edge of the forest like a tripwire. They'd set it up the day before. It wouldn't hurt anybody who walked into it, not permanently, but the magicians would know they were there, and they wouldn't be walking anymore. They'd be lucky if they were conscious. They'd already caught a wild pig that way. Even the insects were hushed. Quentin sneezed. He was mildly allergic to some local plant, and wiped his eyes. On the far side of the meadow, something slipped into the forest. It went just as his eye began to track it. It must have been some standing there, stock still, watching him while he pissed. He got an impression of something large, the size of a big boar, maybe. Quentin fastened his trousers. Zippers were foreign to Fillory, and so far impossible to reverse engineer. He just couldn't explain them to the dwarves, and walked across the meadow to where the animal had been. Standing just on the near side of the blue line, he peered in among the trees. They were thick enough that it was still a full night in the forest. Still, he caught the faintest shadow of a pair of heavy animal haunches receding into it. Is this it? Is it starting? Carefully, like he was stepping over an electric fence, he put one leg over the invisible blue line, then the other, and walked into the forest. He was pretty sure he knew who he was chasing even before he was fully in view. "Hey, Ember," he called. "Ember, wait up!" The god looked at him impassively over his shoulder, then continued to trot. "Oh, come on!" The ram god had not been seen in Fillory since the Breakbills took the thrones, or not as far as Quentin knew. He looked fully recovered from the beating he'd taken from Martin Chatwin. Even his hind leg, which had been crippled the last time Quentin saw him, was restored and could take his weight without a limp. Quentin had complicated feelings about Ember. He wasn't like Ember was in the books. Quentin was still angry that he hadn't been able to save them, to save Alice, in the fight against Martin. He supposed it wasn't Ember's fault, but still, what kind of a god wasn't at the top of the food chain in his own world? The big woolly kind with horns, apparently. Quentin didn't have any particular beef with Ember. He just didn't want to bow down to him the way he always seemed to expect people to. If Ember was so great, he should have saved Alice, and if he wasn't that great, Quentin wasn't bowing. QED. Still, if Ember was here, it meant they were on the right track. Things were going to get very real soon, or at least very Fillorian. He just didn't know which Fillory it was going to be, the beautiful, magical Fillory or the dark, frightening one. Either way, this would be a good moment for a shipment of divine wisdom to arrive. Guidance from on high. A pillar of fire, a tree of smoke. Ember led Quentin uphill, into the interior of the island. Quentin was starting to get winded. After 5 minutes, Ember finally slowed down enough to let him catch up. By that time, they were halfway up a hill, and the sun had at last pushed a hot pink silver of itself up over the horizon. They were high enough that Quentin could look out across the forest canopy. "Thanks," Quentin said, taking big heaving breaths. "Jesus." He leaned on Ember's flank for a second before wondering if maybe that was too familiar, mortal to God. "Hi, Ember. How's it going?" "Hello, my child." That resonant bass voice instantly sent Quentin right back to the cavern under Ember's tomb. He hadn't heard it since then, and his guts clenched. That was not a place he wanted to go back to. He would keep the tone light. "Fancy meeting you here." "We do not meet by chance. Nothing happens by chance." That was Ember for you. No small talk. The ram began to climb again. Quentin wondered if he knew that behind his back, Quentin and the others called him Rambo, and less kindly, Member. "No, I guess not," Quentin said, though he wasn't actually sure that he agreed. "So, how did you get all the way out here?" "Fillory is my realm, child. I am everywhere, and therefore anywhere." "I see that. But couldn't you have just magicked us here instead of making us sail all this way?" "I could have. I did not." Forget it. Quentin could look back now and see the muntjac at anchor, neat and perfect. You could have put it in a bottle. He could even chore neat and... Wait. Could see the muntjac at anchor. There it is. Okay. He could even see the camp on the beach, the bonfires and blankets. But there was no time to admire the view. The ram was taking the rocky slopes of the hill at speed, which was fine for him. He was built for it. He was a ram. Quentin panted and eyed the fluffy pale gold wool on his broad back, and wondered if Ember would let him ride on him. Probably not. "You know," Quentin went on, "while I've got you, I've been wondering about these 7 keys. If you're basically omnipresent and probably omniscient too, why don't you go around and just collect the keys yourself? If they're so important to the realm, I mean, you could probably do it in half an hour tops." "There is deeper magic at work here, my child. Even the gods must bow to it. That is the way." "Oh, right. The deeper magic. I forgot about that." The deeper magic always seemed to come up when Ember didn't feel like doing something, or needed to close a plot hole. "I do not think you understand, my child. There are things that a man must do that a god may not. He who completes a quest does not merely find something, he becomes something." Quentin stopped, blowing, hands on hips. The horizon to the east was a solid band of orange now. The stars were going out. "What's that? What does he become?" "A hero, Quentin." The ram kept going, and he followed. "Fillory has need of gods and kings and queens, and those it has. But it has need of a hero, too, and it has need of the 7 keys. Fillory doesn't ask for much, does it? Fillory asks for everything." With a lumbering lunge, awkward but powerful, Ember surged ahead and surmounted a rocky dome that turned out to be the top of the hill. From there, he turned his head and looked down at Quentin with his strange peanut-shaped eyes. Supposedly, sheep evolved that way so that they could see wolves coming out of the corners of their eyes, better peripheral vision, but the effect was disconcerting. "That's a big ask. Fillory asks for what it needs. Do you, Quentin? What do you need? What do you ask for?" The question stopped him. He was used to scolding and pseudo-Socratic interrogation from Ember, but here was a rare gem, a good question. What did he want? He'd wanted to get back to Fillory, and he'd done that. He thought he wanted to go back to Castle Whitespire, but now he wasn't so sure. The terror of almost losing Fillory had been extreme, but he'd found his way back. Now he wanted to find the keys. He wanted to finish the quest. He wanted his life to be exciting and important and to mean something. And he wanted to make Julia better. He felt like he would do anything to help Julia, if he only knew what to do. I guess it's like what you said, Quentin said. I want to be a hero. Ember turned away again and faced the rising sun. Then you will have your chance, he said. Quentin scrambled up onto the rocky summit and watched the dawn alongside him. He was going to ask Ember about it, about the sun and what it was, and what happened out there at the rim of the world, or whether Fillory even had a rim. But when he turned to ask him, he was alone on top of the hill. Ember was gone. Just when things were getting interesting, he turned slowly in a full circle, but there was no sign of him. Vanished without a trace. Oh well. Now that he was gone, Quentin almost missed him. There was something special about being in the divine presence, even when the divinity was Ember. He stretched, standing at the top of the island, and then jumped carefully down from the rocks and began trotting back down the hill to the beach. He couldn't wait to tell the others what had happened, though the whole thing already felt like a dream, an early morning. Half-awake dream, tangled up with sheets and pillows, and dawn light through closed curtains, the kind you only remembered by chance hours later, for a few seconds when you were going to sleep again at the end of the day. He wondered if anyone else was up yet. Maybe he could still go back to bed. He should have noticed that something had changed, but he'd been distracted on the way up. He'd been practically running, and plus, he'd been talking to a god. And he'd never been an especially assiduous observer of flora and fauna. He wouldn't have noticed a spectacular beech tree or an unusual elm because he didn't know what the difference between them was, if any. Still, after a few minutes, he began to wonder if he was coming down a different way than he'd come up, because it all seemed a little rockier than he remembered. The ratio of rocks to plants and dirt to grass wasn't quite what it had been. He didn't let it worry him too much, because if it worried him too much, he would have to climb back up the hill and find a new way down, and that was the kind of thing he wanted to avoid. And besides, he was keeping the rising sun on his right hand, and that's how navigation works, right? If things really went wrong, he could go all the way down to the beach and cut along the coast. No way he could miss the camp that way. He still had hopes of getting back to the beach in time for breakfast. One thing he couldn't ignore, though, although he tried to for as long as he could, was that the shadows of things weren't getting shorter anymore. In the usual manner of shadows cast by a rising sun, they were getting longer, which would have meant that the orange-red stew boiling at the edge of the sky was somehow no longer a sunrise, but a sunset instead. And it would mean he was on the wrong side of the island, but that was impossible. The strangest thing was that he didn't even realize that somebody had hit him with a sword till after it had happened. All he knew at first was that suddenly he'd lost his balance, and his left arm was numb. "Shit!" he said. He staggered and caught himself with his good right hand on the cold turf. There was a man behind him, a large young man, with a round, pale face and a goatee. The two of them were stuck together somehow. They were connected by a short, broad-bladed sword that was stuck in Quentin's collarbone, and the man was trying to wrench it out. What had saved him was this. Half of Quentin's collarbone was made of hardwood, but there by the put there by the centaurs to replace what Martin Chatwin had bitten out of him. The man with the sword, not knowing this, had unluckily chosen that side when he attempted to cut Quentin in half from behind. "Son of a bitch," Quentin said. He didn't mean the man specifically. He didn't know who he meant. If he'd been thinking clearly, Quentin might have actually tried to win the tug of war over the sword, but in the moment, he just wanted it out of him, badly. They both did. Their interests were temporarily aligned. In a state of almost disembodied fear, Quentin reached up and gripped it with the opposite hand. It cut his palm. The man planted a booted foot on Quentin's back and yanked the sword out with a grunt. They faced each other, both panting. The quietness of it was weird. Real fights happened without a soundtrack. The man was lightly armored, wearing some kind of blue livery, and not even as old as... The man was lightly armored, wearing some kind of blue livery, and not even as old as Quentin. It felt strangely personal. There, alone in a clearing on a silent island, in low-angle evening light. Quentin felt the you-ness of the man intensely. For an endless second, they stared at each other, while Quentin, like everyone else who has ever faced a blade unarmed, made little feinting motions in either direction, as if he were a defender, and the man with the sword was going to try to cut past him to the basket. Just in case he lost that matchup, Quentin whispered the opening words to a spell. A Persian fainting charm. He could do it with one hand, which was lucky because he still couldn't feel his left. Rudely, the man didn't wait for him to finish. He advanced, cutting off Quentin's angles, then lunged appallingly fast, stabbing this time rather than chopping. Quentin twisted desperately to his right and away, but not quite far enough because the sword cut into him. It was incredible that he hadn't made it. In his mind, he was so absolutely sure he would make it, but instead the metal went right into his right side, through his clothes and into his body. He twisted so far around that it went in from behind. At first, the sensation was just strange, this hard, awkward presence taking up space where usually his body was, grinding against his ribs. Then it felt warm, almost pleasantly warm, then almost immediately hot, searing hot, as if the sword wasn't just sharp but glowing white from a forge. "Ah!" Quentin said under his breath, and he sucked air through his clenched teeth, exactly as he'd cut himself chopping an onion. Exactly as if he'd cut himself chopping an onion. The man was obviously a soldier, but Quentin had never really thought about what that meant. He was a professional killer, efficient and businesslike. He had none of Bingle's elegance. He was like a baker, except instead of making bread, he made corpses, and he wanted to make Quentin into one. He wasn't even breathing hard. He jerked the sword out so he could go in again right away, this time aiming for something more vital. Time to make the donuts. Quentin couldn't think. "Itsk!" he shouted. He snapped his fingers. It was just what came to him. It had been nagging at the back of his mind ever since the safe house. He'd gotten it right this time. Light flared between them in the clearing. Startled, the man fell back a step. He must have thought Quentin had hurt him somehow. It didn't take him long to figure out that he was all right, but it didn't take Quentin long to blurt out the Persian fainting charm either. The man dropped his sword and fell forward onto the thin grass. Quentin stood there, panting and holding his side. Blood soaked his shirt. That was too close. Too close. He almost died. The pain was amazing, like a pulsing flare hanging there in the softening early evening, an evening star. Not looking, he couldn't have said with absolute confidence if the pain was even located inside his body. When it couldn't get any worse, he threw up. Sour fish from last night's dinner. Then, it got even worse than that. Gingerly, he took off his shirt, detaching it in one go from the wounded place, and ripped off one of the sleeves. He folded the sleeve into a pad and pressed it against the wound, then tried as best he could to tie the rest of the shirt around him to hold it in place. When it was done, he spent a minute just gritting his teeth and trying not to pass out. His heart was fluttering in his chest like a trapped sparrow. He kept repeating the phrase, damage control, under his breath. It helped for some reason. When he could inspect it again, he saw that the wound was bleeding but not pumping blood. There seemed to be a sharp limit to how deep a breath he could take without his vision going gray with pain. He tried to think what was in there. From the pain, when he moved, the sword must have cut muscle, but it couldn't have reached his lung. Could it? What the hell else was over there? Probably it had just gone into the flank meat. Adrenaline was flooding his system, dimming the pulsing flare of pain, pulling oxygen away from it. It was there, but he started to be able to bear it. As he did, he realized what was happening. It dawned on him with a terrible fiery power. He was having an adventure. A real one this time. That's what the pain was. He looked at his hands. He could feel his left one again. He made fists with both of them. There was a chunky notch in his wooden collarbone, but no deep structural damage. The kind of thing you'd fill in with Bondo. He shook his head. It seemed clear, or clearish. He looked the man snoring face down on the stubbly island grass. He picked up his sword and began walking in the direction the man had come from. The castle was a small three-part affair, a stodgy, boxy keep with two outlying watchtowers, all built out of gray stone, with enormous trees growing around them. The whole layout was visible from where he stood on the rocky hillside. It was built on a grassy knob of land at the foot of the hills that Quentin could now see dominated one coast of the island, screening the castle from other angles of view. No wonder he and the others had missed it. Quentin crept from rock to rock, keeping out of sight of whoever might be monitoring the hillside, zigzagging downhill toward the castle. He didn't meet any more soldiers. Maybe it had just been bad luck. Not wanting to push it, he picked his way down a rocky defile to the edge of the sea. He would approach by creeping along the shore. A narrow crust of rocky beach ran along it, barely enough to keep his feet dry. The sea lapped at it excitedly with dark, rapid wavelets. Quentin wasn't even thinking about what he was doing. If he had to explain it to anybody, that he was preparing a one-man die-hard magical assault on a castle, it would have been difficult to justify. He might have said that he was performing vital reconnaissance, probing its defenses, but all that meant was that if he got scared enough, he was going to run away. What he was really thinking was that this was what Ember had meant, what Ember had given him, his chance. Something was there. Something to do with the keys, or Jollibee, or Julia, or all of them, and he was going to get it and bring it back. And then he stopped. A boat was drawn up on the thin, shingled beach, a gray, withered rowboat. The oars were there, laid neatly inside it like the folded wings of a dragonfly. It was in good repair. The painter was knocked around an overhanging branch. Just like that, Quentin got stuck, mentally stuck. It felt like no force on earth could compel him to walk past the boat without getting in it. He was going to get into it and retreat. He would row back around to the other side of the island to where his friends were. His sword wound would compromise his rowing ability, but not fatally. The sudden sense of inertia was overwhelming. No one could reproach him for cowardice. Indeed, it would be foolhardy to keep going, selfish even. He was actually untying the thin rope from the tree branch. He had to do it with his left hand. Since he couldn't lift his right arm above his head, when a pale face appeared at the far end of the beach. Another soldier. It was eerie how long it took them both to react. Quentin didn't want to believe that the man could see him, or if he did, that he would recognize Quentin as an intruder. But even though the daylight was going by the minute, there was no actual way that either of those things was possible. A cold wavelet broke over Quentin's foot. If the man had run and raised the alarm, that would have been the end of it. But he didn't. Instead, he advanced. He strode down the beach toward Quentin, drawing a short, stubby sword as he came. The twin of the one Quentin was holding. Guess everybody wants to be a hero. Quentin supposed he didn't look especially imposing, but appearances were deceiving. Quentin stuck the first soldier's sword point down in the sand and squared off. Kinetics. He was good with them. He was a physical kid. Whispering fast, reaching back to a Brakebill seminar he hadn't thought about in, 5 years? He held out both hands, palms up, and waved them toward the soldier as if he were shooting away a flock of pigeons. As one, the black pebbles on the shore rose up at the man in a dark stream, like a swarm of angry bees, pelting him in the chest and the face with a rattling sound like a gravel truck dumping its load. Confused, the man turned to run, but he fell after only a few steps, and the rocks buried him into unconsciousness. There now. All at once the fear was gone again, and the pain was gone, and the inertia was gone. Quentin was free to move. He could pass the boat. He'd been free his whole life, if only he'd known it. He walked over to where the man lay half-covered. A warm, damp wind was coming in from offshore. Quentin kicked some rocks away from his face, a narrow, sunburned face, ravaged by acne scars. His story was over for now. Quentin picked up his sword and chucked it as hard as he could out to sea. It skipped once, twice, and sank. He picked up a small flat stone and slipped it into his pocket. A skinny, windy path led up from the end of the beach, through the trees toward the near watchtower. The grade was steep, and he walked up it bent over. It made his burning side feel better. He was afraid of nothing except losing momentum. He rehearsed spells to himself under his breath without actually casting them, feeling the energy build and then letting it die away again. The watchtower was round and built on a steep slope, so coming up on it, even the ground floor was above him. He put a hand on the old exposed foundation. He wondered who'd built it. The bricks felt cool and permanent. Who had built them in this careful, elegant way? Rectangular bricks approximating a smooth circle. Who was inside it? Was it enough that fate or Ember or whoever had stuck these people in his way, that he was now going to hurt or kill them? After all, he couldn't keep this non-lethal shit up all night. Was it enough that one or really two of them had tried to kill him? One of them had even gone so far as to stick a sword in him. Enough thinking. Sometimes it felt like all he did was think, and all other people did was act. He was going to do the other thing for a while, see how that felt. He blew 5 minutes on a silent ritual that was supposed to enhance his senses. at least in theory, though he hadn't done it since he was an undergraduate, and even then he'd never done it sober. His best bet would be to fly up the outside of the tower and surprise whoever was inside from above. Flight was a surprisingly major arcanum, bigger than you'd think, and he worried that using it would leave him with too little juice for a fight. But on the other hand, huge points for style. Nothing made you feel more like a fucking sorcerer than aviating under your own power. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfuckers. Up he rose through the twilight air. The ancient brick rushed by his face in the dimness. There was no noise. He felt his chest empty out a little with the effort. It wasn't so much a feeling of being weightless as one of being supported, touchlessly, somewhere around your shoulders. You were a baby being lifted up by a giant parent, who's a good boy. Quentin's long legs hung down as he cleared the treetops. He wished the others could see him. He shot up above the rim of the tower, arms spread out, one hand holding his stolen sword, the other lit up and crackling with violet witchery in the dimness. At the last second, he cocked one knee up, the way superheroes did in comic books. The man on the rooftop had time to stop swinging his arms back and forth and crane his neck back in shock, squinting, all blonde hair and buck teeth, before Quentin extended his hand toward him, 2 fingers pointed. 2 deep indigo pulses shot out of them and caught the man in the forehead and dropped him. The pulses ricocheted off into the darkness to points unknown. Quentin had had a long time to tinker with Penny's old magic missile spell, and now it ran smooth and precise, with glowy special effects on top. The man's head snapped back and then forward, and he went down on his hands and knees. Another shot to the ribs sent him sprawling over on his side. 3 down. Quentin landed lightly on the stone roof, which had a low wall around it. Again, he felt the absence of a sound track keenly. There was a gun up here. A squat black cannon with a neat pyramid of cannonballs next to it. He took the flat rock that he'd collected from the beach out of his pocket, drawing a dagger from the belt of the unconscious lookout. It was all the man was armed with. He began scratching a rune on it. It was a complicated business, but he could see the rune in his mind, could picture the page of the book where he'd read about it, a left-hand page. It didn't have to be exact, straight lines and right angles, but the structure of it had to be right. You couldn't mung up the topology. When it was done, when he connected the last line to the first one, Quentin felt the joint in his gut, or felt the join in his gut. It was good enough. The power was locked in there. The stone buzzed and jumped in his hand as if it were alive. He waited for just a moment at the top of the stairs. Once he threw that rock, there would be no going back, no slipping off into the darkness. The warm ocean wind poured over him under the darkening sky. The weather was picking up, and the sea was flecked with combers. A storm was rolling in. He had a sudden worry about the man he'd left down on the beach. What if the tide came in? Quentin was pretty sure the water would wake him up before he drowned. A quick, soundless flicker of blue-white light caught Quentin's eye in his peripheral vision. It came from the other watchtower, on the far side of the keep, through the trees. It was exactly as if somebody had taken a flash photo inside. He squinted into the half-darkness. Had he been spotted? Had he imagined it? A long moment passed. 10 seconds. 20. He relaxed again. The other tower ripped open. Something hot and bright and white exploded inside it. The whole top floor blew out, and arcs of power flashed out in all directions, setting the treetops around it on fire. Stones went crashing away through the underbrush. The tower's roof pancaked down onto the floor below it. Just then, out at sea, the rough, bold shape of the muntjac came heeling silently around the point. It was like an enormous, friendly dog he hadn't seen for weeks and weeks, bounding toward him. The others had come. It was all happening. Grinning like a loon, Quentin threw his stone down the stairs and stepped away. A colossal whomp made the roof under his feet resonate like a drum, as the stone gave up the energy he'd locked inside it all at once, explosively. Dust spurted up from between the roof tiles, and air blasted out of the mouth of the stairs. Instinctively, Quentin half squatted, and for a second he wondered if he'd overdone it. But the tower held together. He ran down the steps, prepping another spell, the tip of his sword scraping the wall. The room was dark. He could just make out two men, one lying prone under a broken table, the other trying to get to his feet. Quentin kept running. His mind was clear and ringing with excitement. As he ran, he blew into his hand and shook it to get another spell charged up. Not a moment too soon, because yet another man came pelting up the stairs, hurriedly tugging on gloves. Quentin stiff-armed him straight in the chest, which might or might not have worked anyway. But Quentin's hand was amped up like a taser, and the charge blew the man back down the stairs. Quentin hurled the groaning body and kept on running, out into the square in front of the castle. It had 4 sides, the keep on the left, watchtowers on either end, ocean on the right. There was a small obelisk in the middle. A moment later, Poppy came walking into the open air from the opposite corner. He hadn't realized what he must look like, shirtless and bloody, until she saw him and he saw her expression. He waved in what he hoped was a cheerful and not morbid way. He was about to jog across to her when a stick clattered across the cobblestones next to him. He looked at it curiously, then scrambled violently backward out of the courtyard when he saw that it was an arrow. Poppy saw it at the same time he did. She darted behind the pedestal, singing something in rapid-fire Polish, and a green tracer appeared in the air, like a green laser connecting the arrow to the roof of the castle. She had backtracked its path through the air. She didn't phase easily. It must be an Australian thing. Probably she grew up fighting off snakes and dingoes and whatever else. He'd never seen her cast anything before, and it was amazing. He'd never in his life seen anybody move their hands that quickly. "Oi!" she called, her back to the stone obelisk. "You all right?" "I'm all right." "Elliot and Benedict are finishing in the tower," she shouted. "I'm going in." He pointed to the keep. "Wait, no, Bingle's coming too. I'm going in." He didn't hear what she said next. He was overjoyed to see them, and somehow, weirdly, Poppy, good old Poppy most of all. But he felt a surge of longing at the same time. This was his chance. If he didn't stay ahead of them, if he didn't get there first, he would lose it. And he didn't want to be selfish about it. But if it was all the same to them, he wanted this one to be his show. Quentin whispered a few words to his sword and struck it twice on the ground. It took on a golden sheen. Poppy was working on the end of the green trail from the arrow now. The end became a spark, and the spark raced along the trail like a lit fuse. It disappeared over the parapet, and there was a crack of thunder. Quentin ran for the doorway of the keep. The feeling was absolutely glorious. He didn't know how he knew what to do, but he did. With the others at his back, his last doubt was gone. The doors were made of foot-thick iron-bound beams. He took a skip step, wound up with the sword, and smashed it into them overhand. The spell he'd put on it didn't affect the way the sword felt to him, but it acted on everything else as if it weighed about half a ton. The whole structure vibrated, and the wood cracked and split. More dust. The boom echoed out into the night. Another hit smashed the door halfway in, and another cleared the doorway. Striding into the castle, Quentin felt so full of power it was almost painful. It was bursting out of him. He didn't know where it was coming from. His chest felt huge, its contents over maximum pressure. He was a walking bomb. 5 men stood in the hall behind the broken door, pointing swords and spears at him, and a shout of wind rushed out of Quentin's hands and blew them backward. He blinded them with a flash of light and then threw them bodily down the great hall. It was just so obvious. He turned and put one hand on the ruins of the door he'd just knocked out, and it began to burn. This seemed like a good idea and very dramatic, but just in case it caused problems later, he hardened his skin against fire. He was discovering, in a way for the first time, what it felt like to truly be a magician king. That fat bastard he'd been when he was shitting around Castle Whitespire, playing with swords and getting drunk every night. That was no king. This was a king. Master and commander. This was the culmination of everything that had started the day he'd walked into that frozen garden in Brooklyn, all those years ago. He had at last come into his own. Maybe all he'd needed was Ember's permission. You have to have faith. The ritual he'd done to ramp up his senses was actually working. He was so wired, he could feel where people were through the walls. He could sense the electricity in their bodies, the way a shark does. Time, that dulled mechanism that usually reliably stamped out 1 second after another, like parts on a conveyor belt, erupted into a glorious melody. He was getting it all back now, everything that he'd missed and more. Poppy was right. That time on Earth, it had been an adventure after all. It wasn't just blundering around, it was the build-up to this. And this was living. He would live like this from now on. "This is me," he whispered. "This is me." He trotted up the front stairs and through a series of grand rooms. When people approached him, objects flew at them and battered them to the floor. Chairs, tables, urns, chests, whatever he could get traction on with a spell. Lightning struck and stunned them. Lazily, he stopped a thrown axe in midair with one outstretched hand and sent it back the way it came. Breathing in, he sucked the oxygen out of rooms until the people in them choked and passed out. Blue lips, eyes bulging. Pretty soon they began to run when they saw him coming. He felt altered, like he had grown physically giant. It didn't stop the spells pouring out of him, one after another effortlessly. The enemy troops were mixed, human and fairy and a few exotics, a stone golem of some sort, a water elemental, a red-bearded dwarf, a rather tatty-talking panther. It didn't matter. He was an equal opportunity hero. He was a gusher, a fire hose. He barely even felt the wound in his side anymore. He threw his sword away. Screw swords. A magician doesn't need a sword. A magician doesn't need anything but what's inside him. All he had to do was be who he was, the Magician King. He had no idea where he was going. He just worked room to room, clearing the building. Twice he heard the Muntjacs' guns boom in the distance. Once he threw open a door and found Bingle and Julia backing down a crowd of soldiers amid the wreckage of a drawing room full of ornate furniture. Bingle's magic sword flickered in front of him, as fast and precise as an industrial machine, its glowing tracery leaving hypnotic neon tracks in the air. He seemed to be in a state of martial ecstasy, his tunic wringing with sweat, but his face calm, his hooded eyes having drooped almost to slits. But the real terror was Julia. She'd summoned a kind of transformative magic Quentin didn't know, or maybe whatever it was in her that wasn't human had come to the surface in the fight. He hardly recognized her. Her skin was shining with that phosphorescent silver, and she'd grown at least 6 inches. She fought barehanded. She advanced on the soldiers till somebody was foolish enough to thrust a spear at her, at which point she simply grabbed it like he was moving in slow motion and began beating the shit out of him with his friends with it. Beating the shit out of him and his friends with it. Her strength looked enormous, and metal blades just skated off her skin. She didn't look like she needed help. Quentin found the stairs up to the top floor. He kicked open the first door he saw and almost died when a massive fireball rolled over him. It was a colossally powerful casting. Someone had spent a long time setting it up and pumping energy into it. It enveloped him completely, and he felt the flames licking him, icy through the fireproofing spell. But the spell held. When the fire had dissipated, his limbs were smoking but undamaged. He was standing in the doorway of a darkened library. Inside, sitting at a desk with 2 lanterns on it, was a skeleton in a nice brown suit. Or, not quite a skeleton. A man, but an obviously dead one. He still had flesh on him, but it had shrunk and turned leathery. It was very still in the library. Bookshelves smoldered and crackled quietly on either side of Quentin from the fireball. The corpse watched him with eyes like hard, dry nuts. "No," it said finally. Its voice buzzed and flapped, a blown-out speaker. It obviously didn't have much left in the way of vocal cords. Some unnatural force was keeping it alive, long after its sell-by date. Well, that was my only spell. Quentin waited. The thing's face was immobile, unreadable. Its dried lips didn't cover its teeth completely. It wasn't pretty to look at, but for some reason, Quentin didn't feel angry at it. Why were they fighting again? For a second, Quentin really couldn't remember. He wondered if he'd gotten too far ahead of the others. But no, this was on him. He'd started it, and this was the boss fight. The corpse came to convulse life again, and whipped a throwing knife at him with one skinny, loose-jointed marionette arm. Quentin ducked, purely out of instinct, but it was a wild throw, nowhere near him. It went through the open door behind him and skittered on the flagstones. "All right," it said. "Now I'm really done." The corpse might have sighed. "Where's the key?" Quentin said. "You have one, don't you?" For a terrible second, he worried that it might not. "I don't even know what I'm doing anymore," the corpse said wheezily. It pushed a small wooden box toward him with one shriveled hand. The skin had worn off some of the knuckles, like the leather off the arms of an old chair. "It used to be my daughter's." "Your daughter's?" Quentin repeated. "Who are you?" "Don't you know the story?" It sighed again. It seemed much more resigned to its fate than Quentin expected. He didn't know if it had a breath anymore, but apparently it could still suck in air and out of its leathery chest like a bellows when it wanted to. I thought everybody knew it. Now that he'd stopped moving, he realized he was covered with sweat. It was cold in the nighttime island air. "Wait, you're not going to tell me you're him, the man from the fairy tale? The 7 golden keys?" Is that what they're calling it? A fairy tale. Air hissed between its teeth. Was that laughter? I suppose it's a little late to quibble about things like that. "I don't understand. I thought you were one of the good guys." "We can't all be heroes." "Then, who would the heroes fight?" "It's a matter of numbers, really. Just work out the sums." "But isn't this the key your daughter gave you?" Quentin had a terrible feeling he'd grasped the wrong end of something. That's what the story said. You set her free from the witch, and she didn't remember you, but she gave you the key. That was no witch. That was her mother. More hissing laughter. Only its lower jaw moved when it talked. It was like talking to an animatronic president at a theme park. I left them to look for the 7 keys. I suppose I wanted to be a hero. They never forgave me for it. When I finally came back, my own daughter didn't know me. Her mother told her I was dead. The key kept me alive. It's just as well you're taking it like this. It's terrible living in a dead body. I can't feel anything. You should see how the others look at me. Quentin opened the wooden box. A golden key lay inside it. He was part of the fairy tale now, he supposed. He'd crashed through a shared wall into an adjoining story. Enter the Magician King. Just tell me, the corpse said. What is it for? I never knew. I don't know either. I'm sorry. Footsteps behind him. Quentin risked a glance back. Just Bingle, catching up at last. Don't be sorry. You've paid for it. You paid the price. The life had started going out of it as soon as it let go of the box. It slumped forward, and its head hit the table with a bang. It muttered the last words directly into the wooden desktop. Like me, you just don't know it yet. It didn't move again. Quentin snapped the box shut. He heard Bingle walk in beside him. Together they stared at the dome of the corpse's head, which was as bald and mottled and seamed as a globe. Well done, Bingle said. I don't think I killed him, Quentin said. I think he just died. It is all good. He must have picked that up from Josh. Quentin's crazy power levels were dropping rapidly toward normal again, leaving him feeling wrung out and shaky. He was vaguely aware that he was giving off a nasty burnt hair smell. The fireproofing hadn't been perfect. It was that man, Quentin said, the one from the fairy tale, but his version was different. How did you know to come get me? The cook caught a talking fish. It told us what to do. It had a bottle in its belly with a map inside. What happened to you? Ember came. That was enough explanation for now. Together they walked back down the hall toward the stairs, Bingle eyeing every doorway and alcove for holdouts and dead enders. They'd done it. Another key found. One to go. Quentin was on the scoreboard. They met a chattering Poppy, flush with her first Florian outing. We did it! And a silent, still fluorescent Julia wandering the halls. Quentin showed them the prize and hugged them both, Julia a bit awkwardly, since she didn't really hug him back, and moreover, had retained the extra height from her battle form. Poppy was right. They had done it, and Quentin had led the way. He held on to that victorious feeling, weighed it in his hands, felt its warmth and its heft, making sure he would always remember it. Bingle rooted a straggler out from behind a curtain, but he'd already laid down his weapons. He didn't have a lot of fancy ideas about dying for lost causes. Outside, the muntjac had drawn right up to the wharf. It loomed up abruptly over the stone square. The bay must have been deeper than it looked. Somebody, Elliot probably, had conjured some floating lights, basketball-sized globes that hovered over the courtyard, bathing it in soft yellow-rosy illumination and giving it a country fair atmosphere. The wind had picked up even more, and the glowing spheres trembled and bobbed as they tried to stay in position. And there was Elliot, standing with Josh out on the pier, with the great comforting bulk of the muntjac behind them. Why were they just standing there? The high was all gone now, and Quentin's knees were weak. It was tiring work being a hero. He felt hollowed out, a limp, empty skin of himself. The ache in his side was getting hot again. The thought of his cozy shipboard berth was crushingly comforting. Now that they had the key, he could curl up in it and the great beast would bear him away. He raised a weary hand in greeting. There would be talking now, and explanations and congratulations, the hero's welcome. But for now, he just wanted to get past them and back aboard. Elliot and Josh didn't greet him. Their faces were grave. They were looking down at something on the pier. Josh spoke, but the wind snatched his words away, spirited them off and out over the black ocean. They were both waiting for Quentin to notice, Benedict lying there on the rough, wet wood. There was an arrow through his throat. He was dead. He'd barely made it off the boat. He lay curled around himself, and his face was dark. He hadn't died right away. It looked like he'd clawed at the arrow for a while first, before he finally choked on his own blood. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 20.